beginning, the introductory part of OPAR Chapter 1, you're talking about the way of integrating principles and philosophy being a way to integrate principles and recognizing philosophy as a system of ideas. What you ask is, so principles are one particular instance of ideas. Yes, that's correct. More specifically, a principle would be a type of concept or preposition. It's hard to say exactly what it is. More like just integration of ideas. Like an idea could be something merely as like something crosses your mind, the sky's blue, or I'm hungry. Like those are thoughts, but they're not necessarily a concept. They're not necessarily anything in particular. But we can have different kinds of thoughts. I mean, thoughts about certain topics or certain kinds of information. So you could have thoughts that are concepts would be like integrations of percepts among other information. In a principle, I would say is more like an integration of concepts of action or a combination of different concepts that inform you of something deeper and more expansive. Say a principle being like honesty would be a principle because it's an integration of a number of ideas and concepts into some guide to action or some guide of thinking or behavior. So it's just, as you're saying, a particular instance of ideas.
Yeah. And
philosophy.
So, yeah, sorry.
Ahead. You go ahead.
No, continue, because I was going to ask about something else related. But...
Okay. So that's what it would mean by philosophy integrates all these various ideas and thoughts. Like what is true, false, and consistency and all that stuff. Philosophy gives you a way of integrating it together in at least broad principles that rather than specific concretes or specific items, like you putting it all together in an act of abstraction to think about to get a handle on it.
Yeah, so
philosophy being that it's a broad way of thinking rather than say the details of evolution or different details of writing or sociology or whatever it might be. It's broader than that because it's wider scale and it gives you a guide of thinking and action.
So there were two things that I was thinking about moral action before, but one other thing I got now is a principle. I'd still need to think this over by myself a bit more, but a principle also pertains to thoughts that are then fundamental to whatever the field of study is. So in this case, it's philosophy, and so principles will be those ideas that guide moral actions and are fundamental to the field. Because there are other fields like, in biology or in markets or whatever, where there are people, at least that's the convention, like that's the way people say it. They say there's principles to certain things, principles in marketing or sales or whatever.
Right.
So it's fundamental and it's a guide to action.
And it'd be like a kind of a theoretical framework. In a way, that's Rand's way of thinking about philosophy, that it has a foundation and a structure to it that can be, that's the role of philosophy in Rand's view, is that it assembles a system of thought so that you can handle the world, think about the world, understand what's true or false, things like that. It's a means of thinking. And she thinks that's essential to, or that's what makes something philosophical and why we do philosophy and what's the point of it is.
What makes something philosophical is when it's a means to thinking. Is that what you said?
No, not quite. Well, for Rand, the point of philosophy is to help integrate ideas into a system of, well, as Rand is saying, an integrated view of existence as a human being. Kind of a way to think about that is to put philosophy is just the broadest type of principles and field. So the principles that apply to the broadest topics.
Yeah, so the recurring questions, like for example, this came up in the podcast I was listening to last night. In every moment, you do ask yourself, what should I do? And when you've answered that, once you've done that thing, you still have another question of what should I do? And what science must answer such a question, which just comes up again and again and again. And, you know, when you say, what should I do? You also have to know, well, what is there to do and why, you know, why should I do it? And how do I know if I do it, it'll get me what I want? And all those questions, then, yeah, that's the questions that precede everything else, basically, and that occur again and again. So philosophy is a system that approaches those questions in an integrated way.
Yes, or at least forms a system with which to perform that integrated way. And Rand is providing her system that she came up with to do that, which is the objectivist philosophy. That's her integrated view of existence.
It's interesting because they were also saying in the podcast, someone offhandedly mentioned that those philosophers who had the biggest influence on the world were all system builders. That's how they described it. Not that I have the necessary knowledge base to compare because I haven't studied that much, but that it was interesting because the system builders apparently were the biggest influences.
It would seem to be. I don't know enough about the history of philosophy to say either, but I think it's contestable. But I think that is generally how the world goes and would follow objectivist theory of history, that ideas guide the flow of history.
Yeah.
And whatever ideas can do that the best will not necessarily the best, but whatever ideas will always be shaping the future.
Yeah. We talked about idea being, the sky is blue, and that I've never really given it thought, to be honest, like what an idea is. So then a thought, so a feeling is separate from an idea. Idea is just almost an observation of something, an identification maybe, right? Any form of identification, which is a mental action, is an idea.
I'm not sure if Rand really gives a particular technical definition about idea, only to say that when she talks about thinking and concepts, it's always referring to something like language related, kind of like you could put it in terms of words, and it's not merely a feeling within you, but it's your way of using information. I'm not using a technical definition from Rand, but I'm taking her idea of the way she discusses the use of concepts and concept formation. She's talking about direct recognition, identification, and the information in front of you.
Yeah, so maybe we could say it is like sometimes you can identify something that's concrete and self-evident, like my glass is hot, and I put it in conceptual terms, and then
yes.
that's an idea almost, right?
Yeah, not necessarily conceptual terms, but yeah, just using words or describing it or something more than the sensation of the heat and more than awareness of the heat, but something about the heat. So yeah, it would be a form of identification or recognition in some way that you can apprehend and be conscious of it, more than merely just a sensation, but a recognition and some way to deal with it directly. I think it's important to distinguish that because she's very explicit about how not to use emotions as a means of cognition. So ideas would be just the stuff of cognition, the stuff of whether prepositions, concepts, sentences, grammar, any way you assemble things in a way that you communicate, for example, or you can recognize something. You can see the sky and recognize it as blue. That would be an idea because it's a cognitive action. It's a cognitive event. That's how I would describe it.
Yeah. And so it's broader than thought, because earlier on when you were describing ideas and thoughts, its thought would maybe be inclusive of inference or deduction or some kind of other, whatever those actions are.
That's a bit murkier. It's hard to say. I'll just leave that aside for now. But
Okay.
well, I think of them as the same, but really just think of cognitive action is
Okay.
idea.
All right, cool.
That's really the central point, though. The way Rand discusses this, that's what she thinks about.
Got it. You can see what will probably take a while to get through this book.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, so, okay, my next question was, after reading this and then also listening to the podcast, I sort of have an answer to this. But I set this question up before, which is not everyone has a philosophy, because a lot of, a lot of people, myself included, have a lot of unintegrated ideas. And so philosophy is an integrator, and it helps you live, but it doesn't mean everyone has it. So that's sort of something that I've clarified from that question. I mean, if you have any thoughts on.
I would say, yeah, not everyone necessarily has one. I think everyone has an implicit philosophy in the sense that if you laid out their thoughts and wrote it down and explained it, then you would see, oh, there is a philosophy there, but nothing that they did on purpose or really reflected on or thought about. Not everyone would have done that. It's necessary to integrate some ideas by living your life, but doesn't mean like you did it consciously aware with highly integrated way. Maybe it was hodgepodge, just throwing things together, very unintegrated and a very weak philosophy or almost non-existent, but it would be implicit that there's some approach to the world and thinking always there. Even if it's the rejection of all rationality or a rejection of principles, it's still something.
Yeah, they will have ideas,
so
but
it
won't be a system. They might have implicit ideas, but it won't be a system, because some of those and many of those ideas may conflict. And I have no idea how you choose at what given moment which premise or idea you'd act on, but I think that's pretty common. Yes. And so then that's not philosophy, but they have philosophical premises, which I don't know how you describe it, but given this definition that I'm reading, it does seem like most people wouldn't. It sets the standard pretty high, like for what having a philosophy is.
But of course, following from that, there's different ways to integrate that might create all sorts of systems, and some that are wrong, of course, like maybe a Kantian system would be particularly atrocious to Rand, but it would be a system nonetheless.
Okay.
So she's not merely saying proper systems, but philosophy is a system of ideas.
Oh, okay.
And the system might be bad,
yeah,
but philosophy is that system. And philosophy can help inform you how to integrate properly. And philosophy ought to, or epistemologically speaking, philosophy would provide us the way of finding out the true, or what is true about philosophy or proper systems and whatnot.
So you're saying then some people may come closer to having a philosophy, especially when there's a lot of internal logic to their ideas. Their ideas are integrated and they're to some extent internally logical, but they're not necessarily grounded in reality. So that's a different, that would be the distinction between proper and improper philosophy. And so you're saying some people may actually have more of a philosophic system, and it's integrated, but it's integrated, what do you call it? Integrated contextually, so it's internally logical only, basically.
Yeah, you could say it poorly integrated, unintegrating, or like Peikoff has a book about that. He calls it the dim hypothesis, more specific to him, about that you can either be an integrator, a disintegrator, or a misintegrator.
Oh, okay. Got it.
So there's different ways of integrating, some worse than others, and it's a way to think about it, but that's the more detailed way of thinking of it. But yes, you know the idea. There's like when we talked about moral positions, no one's merely like absolutely in the category of pure evil. Like there's a range of how they can act consistent with their life or not. And there's a degree to which you can fail at that.
Okay, so it's interesting. So Leonard Peikoff wrote in his book about people's different systems of philosophy. So like a misintegrated and I forget whatever categories you just said. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Disintegrated was the other one, like kind of unsystemizing
Okay.
or making systems unstable.
Right.
Um,
This is not so much OPAR related. This is just the next one is a random question, but section was very relevant to me this is what made me want to move on from The Virtue of Selfishness, the book, or the essay, The Objectivist Ethics, because I realized he's talking about philosophic questions being interrelated. One may not therefore raise any such questions at random without the requisite context. If one tries the random approach, this is funny because it's like exactly what I'm like when I'm reading an essay, which is you read an article by Ayn Rand and you glean from it only one general idea with which you decide you agree. Man should be selfish. How is this generality to be applied to concrete situations? What is selfishness? What is selfishness? Does it mean doing whatever you feel like doing? What if your feelings are irrational? But who is to say what's rational or irrational? And who is Ayn Rand to say what man should do anyway? And this is like a completely wrong approach to philosophy.
mhm.
Um, so an idea plucked from the middle is no value, can't be validated. So, I mean, this is more of a general question, which is funny because it's sort of reflective of the same approach of me jumping from thing to thing. But it's like, what is a way to practice, when I'm approaching like studying to do this properly? So I'm not jumping from a million things to a million things that are like from a different context. That's a hard
Mm.
question, I know. So, but it's like I need to consciously actually work on that and not just leave it to.
One way to approach that is think about what you want to get out of that particular reading at that time. You could
Yeah.
always come back and read again to pick up other things. You're bound to pick up other things the next time you read it.
Mm.
So maybe go in it trying to approach what are you trying to learn at that moment? Are you trying to ask what it means to be selfish, or are you just trying to understand what does Rand mean when she says selfish? Are
Yeah.
you just trying to understand what Rand's view is, or do you want to know the specific detail? Is there, like, think about questions you want to know before you start reading, even rather than asking as you go. Because if you ask questions before you start reading, then you probably know you're gonna be asking questions from what you know right now, and you'll see with those questions, we'll see where are you weak on, what are you unable to answer after reading.
Yeah. So in that case, it would be being very clear on what questions I want to answer and reading, and then basically skipping over the rest. And so that might even mean I don't read one book. I'm reading like one chapter of 5 different books in order to answer my question. Um, and work within that specific context that I need to. I mean, it's hard because it's like sometimes like the context I find out is much broader, and then I get stuck. But anyway, okay. I mean, the main thing is have the questions beforehand. In this case, I've done the shotgun approach of just like everything that comes up that I'm like, what's that? I just ask a question about it, and then that leads to other questions.
Yeah, I mean, at least this way it's more organized in how you're approaching it rather than, I know what it's like when things come up as you're reading. They'll definitely come up faster than if you just take it beforehand, because you could recognize the questions, even write them down sometimes, but not fret about them right now. You might see the question in a month from now. It's like, oh, I can answer this now. It's not that bad.
Oh, okay, got it.
And it's sometimes useful to have the question there without necessarily answering right away.
Yeah,
I know it could feel strange not knowing right now and you want to know now, but if you approach it with what you want to learn first, you won't feel as overwhelmed.
yeah,
That's what I try to do with my tutoring, is try to guide you with more uh, systematic way of thinking about these questions rather than shotgunning it. Like, try to connect things more so than just uh, try to question everything immediately.
yeah,
You could write down what a philosophy is and system, then you can start once you get that down, then you can start questioning. It's like, well, Now that I understand what you mean, what do I want to learn by analyzing this? I mean, you could learn, like, do I want to improve, create a better system of epistemology within my own mind? Like, do I want to think about, say, my goals in life better? That's one approach. Or you could think, how do I, if you're a lawyer, like, how do I make some better arguments? That will help you focus where you want to narrow down your questions.
Yeah.
You'll always have questions. At every moment, if you're any like me, and I think you are, so about the way your approach to this, that you'll always have questions, and when I start answering, you'll come up with even more. One question leads to two, which leads to four, and eight, and then so.
All right, cool. So I'll just well, I have done that, to be fair. Like the essay we're reading before, I was just like, yeah, let's just skip this because I can see it's going to come up later. There's too many, like, I could go in a million rabbit holes and it's just pointless right now. So yeah, okay, cool. So I think the main thing is reflect before you approach something, what questions you want to answer. So more evaluation, less sort of reading a book and letting questions come up. Like, yeah, write them down, but put them aside if they're not. This is, again, going back to being consciously directed. Just because you read a book and there's something interesting in it, like, doesn't mean you should go down that rabbit hole. You can if you want to, but it's better to be reflective and evaluate both before and after reading. I think I've got to do that more. So, yeah, cool.
What Peikoff, I think, is trying to emphasize here is thinking in essentials. That's a very objectivist thing to say, or Rand or Peikoff would definitely say things like that. Think in essentials, not all the details. The essentials would be like essential questions, like getting at what are, like you asked, what's a principle? I think that was a good and appropriate question for that, and a good way to analyze it. And that's an essential question. You're not trying to get always right away into the nitty gritty of like what all the different kinds of principles and arguing about whether something is precisely a principle and what counts as a true principle. Like yeah, I mean, but you're thinking in essentials, which is more like what's the concept, what you're referring to in reality, and helping us think better, or add tools of thinking. And that's more the objectivist approach to epistemology, which would reflect in even studying, why not just going into every little tangent, but being observant. Then of course it takes, but being observant and then recognizing what's probably essential, or starting to go at that, and then breaking it down as you need.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, I think after this point it starts getting directly into the metaphysical questions.
Yeah.
The basic axioms. So sum in this context means an enumeration of all attributes and characteristics, right? Let's see. Yeah, the identity of the thing, like all aspects of it, all attributes, all characteristics, every single thing that could be identified within it.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say within it, just everything that it is. Within would imply that there's like another kind of form within it, which maybe just to give a counter example, or what it contrasts with, say, Aristotle might say that there's a form of something, and
there's a what? Sorry?
No, never mind. That example is too complicated. The point is, this is just everything that something is. It's not things that are contained within it, things hanging on it, whatever. It everything that it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have one more question to add to this.
Yes.
Which I'm writing now. In a philosophical context, do I need to make any distinction between attributes and characteristics, or like those kind of words, or it's all just, or is that not really relevant?
Um,
You know, because I've heard
I
like
don't
all
really
these
know.
different synonyms. Like to me, they're all the same. I have no idea. Attributes, qualities, characteristics, aspects, and like I see them used differently. So I don't know if they're significant or not.
I don't think they're significant. I think she's kind of covering her base, like whether you mean attribute or a characteristic, like she basically means either one. They're not anything critically different.
Got it.
That's
All
what it's,
right.
or it's like it's both.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Easy.
Of course, you might see arguments where people do make a distinction, but that would be something about their own way of thinking, or something they came up with.
Yeah.
That they might feel clarifies things, but Rand just means either both of them. They're the
Okay.
same, basically. Like characteristic, aspect, feature,
Oh yeah, feature.
but
Yeah.
slightly different connotations, but
Right.
no fundamental difference.
Right. And the connotations only really matter in literature though, so it
Yeah.
doesn't matter. Okay. Um. What's this? I've tried to bold the part that I think is most relevant, but everything else is just there for context when I paste a quote. This question is about, so this is the axioms, those fundamental
Yes.
identifications that you make that, and there's a section that says like, why use two concepts to identify one fact? And it says the procedure is common in philosophy and other fields as well. When men have several perspectives on a single fact, when they consider it from different aspects or in different contexts, it is often essential to form concepts that identify the various perspectives. So here I think it was about, what was the specific example? Existence and identity as being indivisible. So existence
Yes.
being everything you see, and then like there is something, um, there is existence, and something as opposed to some other thing is identity, but that identification is, yeah, anyway, I'm just sort of trying to get my head around that. And so like what I didn't know you could, I thought concepts try to capture the one, there's like one thing that explains the most other things, but in some uh things that exist there's maybe two or multiple things that explain everything else too. Is that sort of what's being said?
Um, I'll take a step back for a second. So a concept would be more like an integration of perceptual or ideas based on an essential characteristic. So it's not necessarily the essential characteristic is just what it would explain the most about the referent in particular. But it doesn't mean the concept itself is the fact that identifies the most um, essential thing about the concept. Like a concept would include non-essential things too. Like the concept man would include your fingers. It's not
Oh,
essential,
okay.
but
Yeah, I
it's
get what. Yep.
there.
I'm thinking of
So
definition then.
yes, a definition should do that. Yes, which isn't the same thing. Um, let's see. Or
But here they're
the
saying
tricky
two
part.
concepts. So
Yeah.
then in my mind that should be two definitions to identify one fact.
Well, in a way, yes, because existence as one thing and identity as one thing. They're not interchangeable definitions, but they are inseparable from each other. You can't have identity, you can't have identity without existence. So he's basically asking, well, why do we need both of them? Isn't it enough to just have existence? Is it enough just to have identity? Why have both concepts in your head? And he's trying to say that um, but if there's many perspectives on something, it could be uh, helpful to consider from different perspectives in a way that you can. I would argue that capture different information, different concepts, but they could point out essentially the same thing. They could refer to more or less the same thing. Because if something exists as something with an identity, or if something has an identity, then it exists as something. Um, so it might. So if somebody's being argumentative, they might say, well, you only need one of those, but what he's saying here is that by understanding existence, that can help, understanding identity, that can help, and by having both of them, we have a more integrated sense of existence, that within those two concepts, we can explain or talk about a great deal about the nature of reality within those concepts alone.
Right. Is there an example? Are there other examples? Because it says the procedure is common in philosophy. Are there other examples for that, or even examples of just everyday life where you use two concepts to identify one fact? Just so I can help get my head around this idea.
Probably things within physics. I imagine you could have two. Maybe it's not the greatest example, but like what? Like force is mass times acceleration, but then you could be helpful to understand that there's probably other things that also equal force. I can't think of any particular examples right now, but
Okay.
so if you had momentum and velocity and acceleration, they could all relate differently, but they could be expressed in each other's terms.
Yeah.
Or maybe within, I can't think of very many examples offhand. Within philosophy, I could talk about even like what's an example? Yeah, well, you'll have to think of some on your own, but I can't think of any in philosophy at the moment.
What about so going back to this idea of, so there's two concepts, but then what about two definitions to identify one concept? And so both, is it possible then to have a definition that, so the thing, I'm just trying to think of an actual example of something, but the thing that is being identified has two, like it's got one essential characteristic, but it also has something else that is separate from and explains a lot. So in that case, would it make sense to have two definitions for one? I can't think of anything, so I don't know if that even exists, but.
Yes, you can. Leonard Peikoff specific. I mentioned it before. That's a more detailed question, so it does
Yeah, okay.
have something to back it up.
Yeah, okay.
But really, the idea here is that having these two concepts make it easier to handle the information that we're dealing with and the different ways of thinking about something. I mean, you could think about something in terms of what things are. You could think of just things existing, and there's value in that in the way even he describes their indivisibility is a way to understand their importance as individual things. Because it's sensible to say a thing that exists has an identity, and it doesn't seem just tautological. It seems something as an identity, you can think of it like listing all the characteristics of something, but having the characteristics of something would mean to say that it has existence, that it does exist.
Yeah.
I'm avoiding saying has existence because it's not a thing that has an attribute. Existence is not necessarily an attribute, it just does exist. It's not like, oh, it exists. Like it has some independent existence, but then you slap on the characteristic existence, and then it's there. It's like, no, like existence is, you can't like just add it on later. They're indivisible, always there together.
I mean, maybe we can move on, but I'm still having trouble seeing how like the two concepts, like I can see how you can make two identifications from different perspectives of one concept, but not of two concepts identifying. Anyway, that's pretty hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you get the point. I mean, that is one of the things that took me longer to get than other things too. It seems almost redundant a lot of times, but I think the more you reflect on it, the more you'll see that it can be distinguished and pulled apart a bit.
Cool.
But as long as you get the main idea that, I mean, there's existence exists and
they're like two simultaneous facts.
Identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're conscious, then you're conscious that something exists with an identity. Like you're conscious of something.
Yeah.
And that's why they all kind of fit together. By being conscious, you're conscious of something, and you're conscious of something, and it exists. And if it exists as an identity, it's just they all reinforce each other.
Yeah, it goes back to also what what you just said now is that making, when we talked about ideas, is like not conceptualizing, but putting in conceptual form something that is identified by direct perception, that is like right in front of you. Like, okay, something exists. You're just formulating it in these conceptual terms, and it's difficult, but it's right in front of you, right? Like when you're making these observations. So
Yeah, I mean, these are the things most fundamentally in front of you. They're always there at any second, any moment. You can verify these concepts. That's why they're the most broadest concepts you can acquire. Yeah, just be sure to distinguish between axiomatic concepts versus just like an axiomatic statement. I mean, they're concepts in the sense that, like, to refute them, you have to use them in an argument. That you can't argue against it without using it.
yeah.
Right? It's so broad, it applies to everything. But just because you talk about it in terms of sentences doesn't mean it's the same as, like, you don't want to just say the axioms. I mean, I've done that before, and I don't think it's quite as clear. But you want to say axiomatic concepts are these broadest things that encompass about everything, or nearly everything, like existence in particular, encompassing everything and being the broadest generalization that there is.
So explain that again. I don't want to say the axioms. I want to say axiomatic. I didn't understand that distinction.
It's a little more clear if you speak about axiomatic concepts
Oh, okay. They're like
rather, and
starting points, right? The starting points of all knowledge.
I wouldn't say starting point, not
Okay.
by Rand's thinking of axiom.
Oh,
I mean,
interesting.
yeah, in a mathematical sense, sure, that would be an axiom. Like it is deductive, doesn't mean in a deductive way. Here's the starting point, go from here. Like, no, that's not what she's saying. It's more that once you've integrated a great deal of information, then you can come up with these concepts because it encompasses more and you have all the material to think about it. Even though they're fundamental, doesn't mean you begin with those axiomatic concepts. It's not like getting these concepts first are required to get anything. If anything, these come later on because it requires a vast sum of information, then integrate into something and say, oh yeah, everything is existence, or
Yeah.
there's identity to these things. It's
Yeah.
a later step that's yet to be more inductive about it. She's definitely not saying start with these and deduce your answers. Like, no. People sometimes misunderstand that, like make fun of Rand for that. Oh, she just thinks everything you just said is A, therefore everyone should be selfish. It's like that's not even how our argument's supposed to be. She's not being just merely deductive from A is A to say be selfish. Like, no, it's A is just to say that things have identity and you're trying to conclude like this is like I know this is true because it follows identity and whatnot.
Yeah. I know what you're saying. And then so maybe we could describe it instead of a starting point of knowledge. I'm glad you pointed that out. It could be I think I read somewhere in the paper that it was a precondition of thought. Although maybe you don't always need to make the explicit identification of the axiomatic concept, using it is a precondition of thought. I think that's how Leonard formulated it, something like that. What do you think
Yeah,
of
that
that?
would make sense. And I think that's close. I'm not going to say for sure because depending on your context for that, but it sounds good because
Sure.
that's kind of the distinction I was trying to point out. They have the axiomatic concepts that do have to be formed explicitly, but you could think about existence for sure. You might not call it the same concept. You might not even have formed it in an axiomatic way, but you can recognize it. It'd be at least implicit in anything you do.
That makes sense.
So saying existence exists would be more like a proposition. That's not the axiom. Like the axiomatic concept is existence, but existence exists might be, you could call that an axiomatic proposition, you could call it just a proposition, but the distinction there is that one is you've consciously integrated into a concept. The other is just maybe implicitly acting with regard to that concept, or implicitly getting a sense of something.
Mm-hmm. Right. So axiom is self-evident, whereas an axiomatic proposition could be the self-evident formulated in conceptual terms. Just like when I say my glass is hot, and it's like it's you feel it, but you're formulating it in with words.
That's just a way to help to think about it, that you don't get confused, and that the concept is not necessarily the same as what, when you're talking about the preposition. The important thing here is axiomatic concepts, existence, consciousness, and identity.
Yeah.
And that applies to everything that exists. It's the most general statement to make about anything, or most general concepts, most general generalizations that there are, because they encompass everything.
Yep. Cool. So the next thing, let's see what that is. So I was asking about why, sort of this is on topic now, I guess, because I copied this session. Is the explicit identification, so meaning what we just discussed, the axiomatic statements or propositions, required because we have to constantly reason through new ideas and relate them back to the propositions eventually? Is that why I'm just sort of seeing how in practice, if you don't have them, then you will make mistakes in thinking, or like because most people don't, right? If you tell them like existent, I'm struggling to get my head around this, so that's an example of someone who I didn't have these axioms formulated into propositions, but I was still functioning and doing, maybe I could function better, I don't know, but it's still like functioning and living.
Just to clarify things here, I think when he says axioms, he's usually just referring to the axiomatic concepts, just for clarity's sake.
Okay.
So just axioms saying existence, identity, and consciousness. It's easier just to call those the axioms. I do that too, just because it's really a shorthand way of saying the concept of existence, the concept of identity, and the concept of existence. You just say the axioms all. So you refer to all three at once. And yeah, about the implicit and all that, is like what we discussed in the beginning of our discussion, like that you can get a sense of things, maybe you could see things, but yeah, philosophy is the way to integrate this. And so these concepts are a way of systematizing these ideas, a way of creating your integrated philosophy. It creates part of your structure. It's part of your structure always there. And by making it explicit, that's essential to getting a firmer grasp on reality. If you lack the explicit concepts, then it can be much more difficult to handle. It'd be hazier, more confusing, maybe a bit more chaotic.
Maybe that would apply to, so when you're dealing with the more concrete aspects of life, like, oh, I'm thirsty, I'm hungry, or like do this to prepare the food. It's like, that's one thing. But then, yeah, maybe when you're dealing with any sort of reasoning that goes a bit further away from like the things right in front of you, like, oh, it rained because we prayed, and there's less of a direct, obvious connection. It's more one of inference. Maybe that's where these what did we call them? Axiomatic propositions come in. Maybe that's where they. Is that, what do you think of that?
The axioms come in. I think it's more a matter of making it easier to formulate these kinds of questions, or makes it easier to think about what's going on. But if you just say, like, I mean, you could claim that dancing made it rain, but do you even have the tools to even think about it? I mean, if it's just merely a magical worldview, maybe they're not even thinking about identity or existence, just that things kind of have a way of happening without any identity, rhyme, or reason. They just occur. And there's no real way, oh, we're not necessarily conscious, but maybe like the rain god provided us with some kind of way of witnessing his creation. Like, I don't know, things that aren't really formulated as concepts or anything. They're vague generalizations, vague ideas,
Okay.
which might be their best way of answering them. But without these axiomatic concepts, it's hard to be precise and think clearly about it.
Can you think of any modern example? Do you have one in mind where, because I personally can't, like, I think it's pretty hard to have like some example of you or me or just a person you know or a person who's known falling into some error in thinking because of that having axiomatic principles would have prevented axiomatic statements or whatever. I don't know, principles, concept. I don't even know what to call it.
It just depends on the just stick with concepts. That's usually referring to exactly what you mean here.
Yeah, okay.
Like, I wouldn't get into the nitty gritty too much. Just worry about the just what the axiomatic constants are: identity, existence, consciousness, and having knowledge of those is critical to thinking clearly. You can make propositions about them, like existences exist. That's like a statement about that concept, and you can call it axiomatic because it's fundamental.
I mean, I'm bringing this up because, like I can see what is being said and I'm like, yes, that makes sense. But I can't identify any thought process in my mind where I identify a contradiction or an error by making an identification of something contradicting an axiomatic concept. Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm trying to look
Yes.
at it for myself from a practical perspective of like, okay, well, if this is all true, well, where are all these errors that I've made that have then contradicted this, and how do I get good at working that in as a process of thinking? You know what I'm saying?
Yes. So you have I'm not sure it's always going to be the most direct thing. It might be a matter of that now you can think more clearly about what comprises a thing. Like, you could think about in terms of what is this identity rather than just like maybe overgeneralizing or just asking like it's a way of formulating your thinking more clearly. Um, it'd be more clearly because you're better able to think in terms of like, well, if these things are fundamental, well, how can I start thinking about this item or this fact of reality? And so you start thinking about like, well, what's its identity? What's the characteristics of it? And you might think about, oh, how do I recognize that it is a thing? What's the way that I even see it or recognize it? And just by recognizing, does it exist? Does it actually have characteristics to observe consciously? Like, if you can't observe something in any way whatsoever, not even theoretically, then does it even exist? Probably not. You have to be able to identify it. There's nothing unidentifiable that is, in principle, that is real. Like, if you're going to identify anything like electrons, like you have a microscope, eventually you could see it. But you won't want to just come out of nowhere and say, oh, there's these tiny things moving around everywhere. I can't see it or I have no reason to think so. And it just feels true. But I mean, you could use it like inference, like, well, I see these characteristics of something and why is that? Or or I'm conscious of this in this way, but I'm not conscious of, say, that electrons even exist. So why should I even posit that they exist, or are ghosts real? do I need to perceive it in any sense? I mean, that gets really fancy, but it's just the way of formulating your thinking, that you can think in fundamentals, finding the essentials.
Yeah, I'll stop the